Before we begin, do you enjoy listening to our show? Consider subscribing on your preferred podcast platform or supporting us on Patreon for as little as $3 a month. Link is in the show notes. I'm Harper Finley, and this is Night Watch Files. On the evening of May 1st, 1973, 15-year-old Kathy Miller was flipping through the classified ads in the Seattle Times for her boyfriend, Mark Walker. A small ad seeking service station help caught her eye, and the next morning she called the number. The man on the other end practically conducted a full interview over the phone, despite the position not being intended for her. By the time she hung up, Kathy had given him her home address, her phone number, and agreed to meet him in front of a local Sears store that same afternoon, where he'd pick her up in his car and drive her to fill out an application. Her mother, Mary, had heard the whole thing from the next room, and she was immediately unsettled. A legitimate employer, she told Kathy, would have applicants come to them, not offer to collect a teenage girl from a street corner. Mary was so troubled that she missed her morning bus just to make Kathy promise not to go. She even called the Seattle Police Department's sex crimes unit, where a sergeant told her the setup sounded suspicious and that Kathy should stay home. Kathy promised, and then she went anyway. She ran into Mark near the Sears corner around 2:35. They joked briefly about how unbusinesslike the whole arrangement seemed. A street corner pickup, a stranger in a purple car, and then let it go. Mark waited as long as he could before leaving for his paper route, and when he did, Kathy was still standing there alone. That evening, Mary called the number from the ad when Kathy failed to come home for dinner. The man who answered said Kathy had never shown up, but Mark confirmed he'd left her on that corner, waiting. Mary Miller was born Mary Pergolus in Riga, the capital of Latvia, to parents who were both highly respected judges. She enjoyed a comfortable, happy childhood surrounded by a close extended family until the onset of the Second World War. As Russian and German armies repeatedly invaded, her family was forced to flee their home and head west, walking and riding coal trains after a failed attempt to cross the Swedish border. They eventually arrived in Dresden only to find the city flattened, and a boat they were supposed to escape on sank. During this period, the family endured severe starvation. Mary later recalled the reality of starving, noting that hunger eventually stops hurting. She only felt sick when she finally had something to eat again. The family eventually ended up living in a displaced persons camp, which Mary was careful to distinguish from a concentration camp. Looking back, Mary noted that because she was just a child, she didn't fully comprehend how terrible their situation was at the time. Eventually, a sponsor brought her entire family to the United States, where they settled on Anderson Island in Puget Sound, Washington. Mary attended Clover Park High School in Tacoma, alongside the children of guards from the McNeil Island Federal Prison. Although she initially struggled with American English, she was highly intelligent and resilient, learning the language rapidly so she could graduate. Because the last ferry back to her island left at 7 p.m., she would occasionally sleep over at the Western Washington State Hospital, where Latvian doctor friends worked, so she could attend evening school functions or go to the movies. After high school, Mary moved to New York City to seek her fortunes, where she eventually married and became a new mother. At the age of 25, she gave birth to a healthy, blonde baby girl named Kathy Sue Miller, on May 23, 1957, at the French Hospital in New York. It was during a humid New York heatwave in August 1957, when Kathy was just 4 months old, that Mary experienced a terrifying nightmare. She dreamed that she had a 14-year-old daughter with long dark hair who had been horribly injured and was covered in blood. In the dream, no matter how hard she tried, Mary was completely powerless to help the severely hurt girl. She woke up in absolute terror, and although she never had the exact dream again, the portent of evil clung to her conscious thoughts and haunted her for the next 15 years. Following Kathy's birth, the Miller family moved around the country before eventually settling in Salt Lake City, Utah. About 17 months after Kathy was born, Mary gave birth to her second child, a son named Kenny. While Kathy developed rapidly, she was quick to sit up, crawl, walk, and talk. Kenny was noticeably slower to develop. Mary later suspected that Kenny's developmental delays were caused by either medical negligence during his birth or exposure to radioactive fallout from atomic energy tests conducted in the Utah desert. Kenny's delays were permanent, and he was eventually placed in special education classes. As they grew up, Kathy was fiercely protective of her younger brother, making sure no one made fun of him or took advantage of his disabilities. The Millers' marriage eventually fell apart, and Mary's ex-husband lost contact with the family, having not seen the children since Kathy was 3 years old. By the time Kenny was old enough for kindergarten, Mary had moved the family to Seattle, Washington. There, Mary bought an older home in the north end of the city and took a job working at a bank. Despite being a single mother, Mary provided a loving and supportive environment for her children through her close-knit extended family. Mary's grandmother and great-aunt moved into the home to care for Kathy and Kenny while Mary worked, and Mary's parents lived just a few blocks away. Throughout Kathy's childhood and early adolescence, Mary's parenting was deeply influenced by the nightmare she had experienced and was extra vigilant about Kathy's safety. She constantly checked on her, dropped in to supervise when Kathy was old enough to babysit, carefully read newspaper articles to her daughter about young women who had met with tragedy, and frequently warned her about the dangers of hitchhiking and talking to strangers. On the last weekend of April 1973, Kathy was followed by an unknown man as she walked from the University of Washington, where she had been taking swimming lessons. She noticed the man was walking just behind her, deliberately turning corners exactly when she did. He continued to trail her all the way to her bus stop. Deeply frightened by the man's relentless pursuit, the slender teenager ran all the way to her North Seattle home. When she arrived, she was highly distressed and told her mother what had happened. The incident left both mother and daughter terrified. In response to the stalking, Mary promised Kathy that she would accompany her to the pool the following weekend to ensure her safety in case the man returned. Just a few days later, 15-year-old Kathy was looking through the classified ads in the evening edition of the Seattle Times. She wasn't actually looking for a job for herself, as she already had a tentative appointment to work as a nursing home aide the next day. Instead, she was searching for a part-time job for her boyfriend, Mark Walker. She spotted a small ad seeking service station help and immediately thought it would be a great opportunity for Mark. After an initial unsuccessful attempt to call the station on Tuesday evening, Kathy tried the number again at 8 a.m. on Wednesday, May 2nd. During the call, Kathy initially inquired about age requirements, but then excitedly exclaimed, "Oh, you take girls?" after learning the station owner was interested in hiring female attendants. The man on the other end practically interviewed the teenager over the phone. Kathy answered his questions with a series of yeses and nos, and eventually provided him with her home address and phone number. The call concluded with the man arranging to pick Kathy up in his car in front of a local Sears store at 2:30 p.m. that afternoon, so he could take her to the station to fill out an application. Kathy's mother overheard her daughter's side of the conversation from the next room and was immediately unsettled. Mary was deeply concerned that Kathy was giving out specific personal information to a complete stranger, especially having just endured an unsettling stalking incident. When Kathy excitedly relayed the details of the arrangement, Mary explicitly warned her daughter not to go, reminding her of a recent news story she had read about a girl who had been raped after being lured into a car by a fake job offer. Mary felt that a legitimate employer would expect an applicant to come to the place of business themselves, rather than offering to pick them up on a street corner. Mary was so anxious that she missed her morning bus to work just to reiterate her warnings to Kathy, making her daughter promise not to meet the man. Despite Kathy's promises, Mary's motherly intuition kept her on edge throughout the morning. She was particularly troubled by the phone number's prefix, which indicated the station was in their local neighborhood, meaning Kathy could have easily walked there and did not need a ride at all. Driven by these fears, Mary called the Seattle Police Department's Sex Crimes Unit, where a sergeant confirmed that the setup sounded suspicious and advised her to ensure Kathy did not attend the meeting. Unfortunately, Kathy ignored her mother's warnings. After school, she walked to the designated Sears corner. She happened to run into her boyfriend, Mark Walker, around 2:35 p.m. and explained that she was waiting to be picked up in a purple or wine-colored car for a job interview. Both teenagers briefly joked about the nature of the street corner meeting and the possibility that the man might have ulterior motives, but shrugged it off. Mark waited with Kathy as long as he could, but had to leave for his paper route just before 3 p.m. When Kathy failed to come home for dinner, Mary's worst fears began to materialize. She called the number from the ad, and the man answered, claiming Kathy had never shown up for a 2:45 p.m. appointment. After calling her daughter's friends and realizing she was truly missing, Mary dialed 911. An hour later, 2 patrolmen from the Wallingford precinct visited her home. She asked them to trace the unlisted phone number from the want ad, but they warned her that it might be impossible to do so that night because the phone company's offices were already closed. Later, at 10 p.m., Mary finally reached Kathy's boyfriend, Mark Walker, who had been unavailable earlier because he was at a junior achievement meeting. After confirming with Mark that he had left Kathy waiting for a stranger in a purple car, Mary's fingers trembled as she immediately dialed 911 a second time. Even though she felt she now had vital information about her daughter's disappearance, the 911 operator told her she would have to wait until the juvenile detectives came on duty at 7:45 the next morning. Determined to get help right away, Mary called the Wallingford precinct directly and asked for another patrol car to come back to her house. About 45 minutes later, a single officer arrived, took a report, and promised to try checking the unlisted phone number. However, just like the 2 officers who had visited earlier that evening, he warned her that it might be impossible to trace the number until morning. No officers reported back to Mary that night, leaving her to pace the floor until then, desperately hoping against her worst fears. In the morning, Mary contacted the juvenile unit and spoke with Detective Marilyn McLaughlin, who promised to track down the reports and check the number. At 11 a.m., Detective McLaughlin called Mary back with the first major piece of information. The phone number belonged to a business at 72116 Aurora Avenue North, and the owner's name was Harvey Carignan. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. Mary was deeply frustrated to learn police lacked the probable cause necessary to raid Carignan's Savmore gas station and promptly arrest him. Refusing to wait helplessly, she launched her own intelligence-gathering operation. She dispatched her sister to conduct reconnaissance, driving slowly past the station to record the license plates of 2 vehicles parked on the premises, a maroon Pontiac and a white over maroon car. Leveraging her position at a local bank, Mary ran a credit check on the suspect, finding his recent financial history frustratingly clean. Desperate to cut through the legal red tape, she bombarded powerful contacts with phone calls, reaching out to the FBI, the chief investigator for the Boeing Airplane Company, and local newspapers. To aid the official search, she also supplied Detective McLaughlin with photographs of her missing daughter and a blue and white fabric swatch matching the homemade jumper Kathy was last seen wearing. Meanwhile, the Seattle Police Department initiated its preliminary steps based on the newly acquired name. Detective McLaughlin's initial visit to the station yielded nothing, as Carignan was absent. It wasn't until the evening shift that patrol officers tracked the suspect down at his North End home, arranging a meeting back at the station. There, Carignan smoothly denied any physical encounter, claiming the teenager simply never arrived for her 2:45 p.m. appointment. Investigators also interviewed a station attendant named Candy Erling, who recalled a girl arriving in a white Chevrolet seeking a job to fund a trip to California, a description Mary definitively confirmed did not match Kathy's circumstances or travel plans. Behind the scenes, the investigative machinery began to turn. On the morning of Friday, May 4th, the disappearance of 15-year-old Kathy Miller officially crossed the threshold from a routine missing persons inquiry into a potential homicide investigation. By the luck of the draw, the file landed on the desks of homicide detectives Billy Bauman and Dwayne Homan, two seasoned investigators who immediately recognized the ominous undertones of the teenager's vanishing. Their first step was to review the accumulated reports, meticulously piecing together the timeline of Kathy's last known movements and her intended street corner meeting with service station owner Harvey Carignan. The detectives' worst fears were practically confirmed when they pulled Carignan's FBI rap sheet. Staring back at them was a chilling criminal history that included a string of burglaries, multiple sexual assaults, and a prior murder conviction that had been overturned on a legal technicality. Armed with this grim profile, Bauman and Homan left the precinct and drove to the local bank to interview the missing girl's mother, Mary Miller. Amidst her trembling hands and cigarette smoke, Mary recounted the excitedly naive phone conversation her daughter had with the stranger offering a job. The detectives faced the agonizing task of explaining to a desperate mother the strict constraints of the law. Without a body, blood, or a witness who had actually seen Kathy get into Carignan's car, they completely lacked the probable cause necessary to secure a search warrant for his property or to make a swift arrest. Before leaving the bank, they methodically gathered a list of Kathy's friends, relatives, and potential job locations, and officially ruled out her estranged father in Utah as a suspect. Their next crucial stop was to delve deeper into the mind and background of their prime suspect. The detective duo tracked down the parole officer who had most recently supervised Carignan. Pulling the files from his 1968 parole, the officer painted a portrait of a man with a volatile and dangerous dual nature. While Carignan could appear straight when things were going well, the officer warned that he harbored a capacity for extreme violence, noting that he had once required 6 guards to subdue him after he severely beat a prison officer, and that his ex-wife had been absolutely terrified of him. "If you have to arrest him, he'll be dangerous," the parole officer warned. The first major break in the disappearance of Kathy Miller did not come from a seasoned detective or a police informant, but from a well-meaning timekeeper at a plywood mill 26 miles north of Seattle. Early on a Tuesday morning, Mary Miller received an unexpected phone call from a man in Everett, Washington, who stated simply that he had found her daughter's algebra book. The timekeeper explained that an employee reporting for work had discovered the algebra text, a German book, and Kathy's social security card resting on a ledge abutting the Everett Plywood Company's parking lot at 4 p.m. on Thursday, May 3, the day after the teenager vanished. Because a group of school children had toured the mill the day Kathy disappeared, the workers initially assumed a student had set the books down and forgotten them. After trying unsuccessfully to locate the owner throughout Thursday, the timekeeper finally dialed a phone number scrawled inside the front cover of the algebra book, unknowingly reaching the missing girl's frantic mother. Alerted by Mary, Seattle homicide detectives Dwayne Homan and Billy Bauman raced to the Everett Mill. The discovery site bordered railroad tracks lined with waiting boxcars, prompting a desperate and immediate search of the area. The detectives crawled through the dark corners of the boxcars and clambered over massive stacks of rough fir logs, hoping against hope they might find Kathy hidden in the crevices. During the intense scramble over the timber, Detective Bauman lost his footing and fell heavily from a tall stack, snapping his ankle. He ignored the sharp pain long enough to ensure the area was clear, but the sweep ultimately yielded nothing. Kathy was nowhere to be found. Back at the Seattle Police Crime Lab, the books proved to be a source of immense forensic frustration. The timekeeper had unknowingly wiped the book covers dry after finding them wet from the rain, obliterating any potential fingerprints left on the exterior by the abductor. Criminalist Carl Jepsen meticulously treated the interior pages with the ninhydrin process, a chemical method used to raise latent prints from paper. He successfully isolated portions of prints from a left index and middle finger on an April 30th homework assignment tucked inside the algebra book. However, the forensic trail went cold. When the lab compared these latent prints against the suspect Harvey Carignan's file, they did not match. The discovery in the Everett plywood lot yielded no physical evidence to link Harvey Carignan to the crime. It did, however, provide a chilling confirmation for the detectives. Someone had taken Kathy, or at least her possessions, far away from the busy Seattle street corner where she was last seen, signaling a mobile, calculated abduction. With the discovery of Kathy Miller's abandoned school books 26 miles away, investigators were convinced the teenager was dead, prompting them to directly confront their prime suspect, Harvey Carignan. To ensure he didn't bolt at the sight of authorities, Detective Roy Moran covertly monitored the Savmore gas station from a hidden vantage point while Sergeant Bruce Edmonds and Detectives Dwayne Homan and Dick Reed walked onto the premises. Homan introduced the team, stated they were investigating Miller's disappearance, and began reading Carignan his Miranda rights. Before the detective could even finish the familiar cautions, Carignan hurriedly interrupted, attempting to establish an alibi by claiming he had been too busy running his business and collecting auto parts to have encountered the missing girl. Undaunted, Homan finished reading the rights and began the interrogation. Carignan smoothly admitted to speaking with Kathy on the phone and arranging a 2:30 p.m. meeting, but claimed an employee told him Kathy had actually shown up at the station with two hippie-looking guys while he was out. However, when Homan pressed him about the arranged pickup at the Sears store, Carignan's composure cracked. He began to sweat profusely, and his face twitched nervously. He admitted driving to the designated corner in his 1966 Oldsmobile Toronado, but insisted Kathy was not there, stating he waited only 2 or 3 minutes before leaving to fetch auto parts. Homan continued to probe, questioning Carignan about the station employee, whom he claimed had no employment records or known address, and asking if anyone else had driven his car, to which he evasively claimed his Toronado had been towed for repairs. Bringing the tense confrontation to a head, Homan bluntly asked if Carignan would be willing to take a polygraph test regarding the matter, to which he initially replied that he would. Employing a classic interrogation tactic, the detectives abruptly ended the conversation and walked out of the office. An anxious Carignan trailed behind them, nervously asking if passing the lie detector test would eliminate him as a suspect. When Homan confirmed it would, he immediately asked what would happen if he failed. Homan flatly informed him that the police would become far more concerned and that the investigation would bear down heavily in his direction. Faced with that grim reality, Carignan's cooperative facade slipped, and he told the detectives he would consult his lawyer before making a decision. In the tense weeks following the disappearance, the atmosphere inside the Carignan household grew increasingly suffocating. Harvey Carignan's behavior underwent a disturbing shift. A man who had once demanded extensive time alone suddenly refused to let his wife Alice out of his sight. For Alice, the strain of her husband's erratic, possessive hovering was compounded by her own mounting, silent suspicions about his involvement in the teenager's vanishing. The breaking point arrived late one evening when Alice's brother pushed his way into their home. Ignoring Alice's terrified pleas to stay quiet, he confronted Harvey directly about his unexplained 6-hour absence on the day Kathy vanished, bluntly demanding, "Why did you kill her?" Harvey's response was swift and brutal. He viciously beat his brother-in-law, who later warned police that Alice was paralyzed by fear and only remained in the marriage because she was scared to death of what Harvey might do to her. Driven to the edge of her endurance, Alice finally orchestrated her escape. She fled the house, leaving behind a desperate note on the refrigerator. The message begged Harvey for the truth, dangling a conciliatory promise that they might reconcile if he confessed. But behind the scenes, Alice's true intentions were far more absolute. She confided to Seattle homicide detectives Dwayne Homan and Billy Bauman that she planned to seek an annulment, firmly convinced that her husband was a murderer. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. What followed was a desperate life on the run. Aided by her brother, Alice went into hiding, moving to a different location every night or two in sheer terror that Harvey would hunt her down. The fear was contagious. Even Alice's mother abandoned her own home and went into hiding to avoid Harvey's relentless inquiries. When Alice finally needed to return home to retrieve basic clothing and necessities, she was too frightened to go alone. She asked detectives Dwayne Homan and Billy Bauman to escort her back to her house. It was during this tense visit to the home she once shared with her husband that Alice offered investigators what seemed like a miraculous break in the case. Days earlier, a nervous Harvey Carignan had specifically ordered Alice to take his purple Oldsmobile Toronado to a car wash and ensure the interior was thoroughly vacuumed. However, Alice had seen no need to use the car wash's vacuums when she had a perfectly good one at home. She washed the exterior but vacuumed the interior at her house, a secret she kept from Harvey. "I vacuumed Harvey's Oldsmobile out with that, and the stuff is still in the bag," Alice told the detectives as she showed them the machine. "I guess you can take it if you want." Homan and Bauman eagerly confiscated the dust bag and the attachment brush Alice had used on the car's interior. For the detectives, the bag felt like the physical evidence they desperately needed to secure an arrest. They had already collected strands of Kathy Miller's hair from a hairbrush the missing teenager had left behind. The investigative team hoped that criminalists at the police crime lab, utilizing a highly sensitive scanning electron microscope, would be able to sift through the Toronado's dust and isolate microscopic hairs that matched Kathy's in class and characteristics. Unfortunately, the investigation had been saturated with bad luck from its inception, and the vacuum bag proved to be just another agonizing dead end. When the crime lab analysts finally completed their meticulous examination of the bag's contents, the results were disappointing. They found absolutely nothing inside the dust bag that could be connected to Kathy Miller. May 23rd should have been a day of joyful celebration for the Miller family, marking Kathy's highly anticipated 16th birthday. Clinging to a Latvian superstition that an owner will eventually return if they leave a possession behind, Kathy's grandmother, Rosalie Pergolas, steadfastly continued sewing the dress she was making for the teenager's birthday. Meanwhile, her mother, Mary, went ahead and purchased the 10-speed bicycle Kathy had so eagerly yearned for, knowing that failing to buy the gift would mean admitting there was no daughter left to give it to. With all other leads exhausted, investigators asked the grieving mother if she would agree to meet with the media once more in hopes of shaking loose new information from the public. Mary agreed, and on Kathy's 16th birthday, a massive media blitz blanketed the city, with full-page stories running across all Seattle newspapers. The coverage featured a stark visual contrast: a slightly blurred photograph of a sweetly smiling Kathy, juxtaposed against clear, strained images of Mary Miller and Mark Walker, the boy who was likely the last person to see Kathy alive before her abductor. Looming ominously among the photos was another blurred image, a surveillance camera shot of suspect Harvey Carignan, his face set in a furious, frowning mask. Driven by the poignant newspaper spread of the missing teenager, alongside Carignan's scowling surveillance photo, the police switchboards lit up. By the end of May, the homicide unit's log had swelled with over 100 tips. While many were frustrating dead ends, ranging from well-meaning but mistaken sightings to cruel ransom hoaxes, deranged callers known in police jargon as 220s, and bizarre psychic predictions, other calls painted a disturbing portrait of the Savmore gas station owner. Several young women came forward to report Carignan's predatory behavior, describing inappropriate sexual propositions that he had disguised as job interviews or tire sales. With the publication of his photograph, the gloves officially came off. Carignan, who had developed an intense hatred for homicide detectives Billy Bauman and Duane Homan, was enraged by the media exposure. While he refused to speak directly to the press on the advice of his attorney, he publicly fired back at the investigators, angrily charging that the police were harassing him, his family, and his associates. "Those two, that Homan and Bauman, they're zeroing in on me because of my felony record," Carignan complained to the press, attempting to cast himself as the victim of a malicious police witch hunt. He also purchased a new ball-peen hammer and showed it to an employee, stating, "This is to take care of Homan and Bauman," expressing his desire to crush the detectives' heads before he left town. Unable to handle the mounting pressure, the loss of his wife, and the constant police tails, including the department's Air One helicopter, Carignan decided to cut his losses and flee the Pacific Northwest. Born on May 18, 1927, in Fargo, North Dakota, Harvey Louis Carignan entered a world that offered him little comfort or stability. His birth was illegitimate, a circumstance that carried a heavy social stigma in that era, and his biological father, reportedly a medical intern, vanished from his life before the boy could even form memories. The earliest home Harvey could recall was near the tiny hamlet of Baku, North Dakota, during the darkest days of the Great Depression in 1930. His mother, barely 20 years old and ill-equipped to raise a child, struggled to support him, leaving the undersized, nervous toddler feeling profoundly unloved and unlovable. When Harvey was around 4, his mother married and gave birth to a second son, leaving Harvey to navigate a tenuous relationship with a stepfather he came to view as his true father. From the beginning, Harvey was a troubled child who failed to thrive. He was plagued by chronic bedwetting and a nervous condition known as St. Vitus's dance, or childhood chorea, which caused his features to twitch spasmodically whenever he was under stress. Adding to his fragile psychological state was a deeply entrenched terror of women, stemming from what he later claimed was severe sexual abuse by female relatives and babysitters. He alleged that these grown women rubbed themselves all over him and used their bodies to smother and suffocate him, turning what should have been maternal comfort into a terrifying source of anxiety and repressed rage. Unable or unwilling to cope with his chronic bedwetting, minor thievery, and erratic behavior, Harvey's family continually rejected him, shuffling the young boy from one household to another. He was sent away to live with an aunt and uncle in Cavalier, North Dakota, and later shipped to his grandmother and then another aunt in Williams, Minnesota. Each time he was sent back or ran away, desperately seeking a home with a mother who considered him a burden. She may have viewed his constant twitching as a sign of mental illness, or she simply could not deal with his perverse behavior. Ultimately, when Harvey was just 11 years old, his mother told a local judge that she could no longer keep him. Despite his stepfather's pleas to give the boy one more chance, his mother refused, and because there were no orphanages available, Harvey was locked away in the North Dakota Training School in Mandan in 1939 at 11 years old. There, he entered a frightening new environment that would serve as his home for the next 7 years. Initially, the scrawny, twitching youth found himself the target of older, larger inmates who regularly beat him up. To alleviate the physical bullying, administrators eventually placed Harvey and another undersized boy in a separate room, though the relentless teasing from his peers continued. While he managed to survive the inmate hierarchy, it was the institution's staff that left the most profound and twisted psychological scars on the growing boy. Discipline inside the reformatory was largely meted out by female staff members, and Harvey later claimed their punishments were both arbitrary and bizarrely abusive. He recounted instances where the women would punish him for no reason by holding him forcefully against their breasts or stomachs, simulating choking and suffocation. Whether these accounts were completely factual or distorted by his own developing aberrations, Harvey spent his formative years firmly believing that women were seductive, sexually abusive giantesses who held total control over his life and could use him for their own purposes. This perceived abuse stimulated him sexually long before he was mature enough to process the resulting mix of arousal, anxiety, and repressed rage, cementing a deep-seated terror and hatred of women. While the world outside waged the Second World War, Harvey spent the entirety of his puberty isolated within the reformatory's walls. Physically, the institution changed him, fueled by the high-carbohydrate meals favored by the facility and protein from the training school farm. He shed his rabbit-faced childhood appearance and grew into a tall, husky teenager. By the time his 7-year sentence concluded in 1946, the 18-year-old had finally stopped wetting his bed, though his face still twitched uncontrollably whenever he was under tension. Having lived virtually his entire life within an institution, the ill-prepared young man immediately traded the walls of Mandan for the regimentation of the United States Army. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. By 1948, Harvey Carignan's military career had brought him to the sprawling landscape of the Alaskan Territory, where he was assigned to Fort Richardson in Anchorage. The historical record offers no specifics regarding his day-to-day military duties during his 3-year enlistment, but it paints a grim picture of his off-duty life while he was stationed at the base barracks. For the young soldier, life outside the regimentation of the fort revolved largely around heavy alcohol consumption. He later confessed to spending his free time bar-hopping with companions in Anchorage. It was during these drunken, off-duty excursions that his deep-seated rage against women violently surfaced. On Sunday, July 31, 1949, after a full day of drinking, Harvey encountered 57-year-old Laura Showalter. Taking her to a small local park, he attempted to rape the older woman. When she resisted, the husky soldier savagely bludgeoned her to death with his bare fists, crushing her face and leaving her partially nude, battered body in the grass. Less than 2 months later, on the morning of September 16th, the intoxicated soldier struck again. Carignan confronted a young woman named Dorcas Callan on an Anchorage street near a tavern. When she refused his advances and asked him to go away, he grabbed her and dragged her into a nearby ditch, tearing at her clothing and groping her in a frantic rape attempt. Callan fought back desperately, clawing her way up the soft dirt walls of the pit to escape. Callan's desperate escape set in motion the first major downfall of Harvey Louis Carignan. Armed with her precise description of a husky soldier with a deeply dimpled chin, police quickly apprehended the 22-year-old Carignan and booked him into the city jail. Placed in a 5-man lineup, he was immediately identified by Callan as her attacker. Significantly, the lineup was also viewed by John Keith, the witness who had stumbled upon the brutal murder scene of Laura Showalter weeks earlier. Keith identified Carignan as the man he had seen hovering over Showalter's body, providing the critical link between the attempted rape and the unsolved homicide. While Harvey Carignan quickly admitted to the assault on Callan, he steadfastly refused to discuss the Showalter murder with Anchorage detectives. Frustrated, authorities transferred him to the office of U.S. Marshal Herring, a man renowned for his skilled interrogations. The questioning began on Saturday morning without Harvey first being arraigned before a magistrate on the murder charge. After speaking privately with a Catholic priest, Harvey requested paper and pencils, spending the weekend alone in his cell drafting a statement. However, when he handed the narrative to Herring on Monday morning, it was merely an account of his drunken bar hopping, entirely omitting the murder. When Herring pressed him, Harvey admitted he was terrified of the gallows. Herring gently noted that there had not been a hanging in the Anchorage Judicial Division since 1922, and slowly built a rapport with the suspect by sharing stories of his own unhappy childhood in an orphanage. In a climactic moment, after more than 30 hours together, Herring directed Harvey's attention to a picture of Jesus Christ on the office wall, urging him to set yourself right in the eyes of your Maker, Harvey, by confessing the true facts. Staring into the painted eyes of Christ, Harvey sighed and broke. He dictated a full confession, detailing how he had attempted to rape the older woman, and when she resisted, bludgeoned her to death with his bare fists. In early 1950, Harvey went on trial for first-degree murder, with the prosecution relying heavily on the confession extracted by Marshal Herring. To Harvey's absolute shock, he was convicted and sentenced to hang, completely upending his naive expectation that he would simply be sent to a federal penitentiary where he could learn a trade. But the execution never came to pass. His defense attorney, Harold J. Butcher, appealed the conviction, arguing that Herring had acted as a father confessor and that the confession was obtained before Harvey was formally charged before a magistrate. In December 1950, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the confession had been admitted in error. The territory of Alaska pushed the case all the way to the United States Supreme Court in October 1951, but the highest court in the land upheld the reversal. The justices agreed that the McNabb rule, which dictates that confessions must be excluded if obtained during an illegal detention before a prisoner is promptly brought before a committing magistrate, had been violated. Blocked by this legal technicality, prosecutors realized they could not retry Harvey for murder without placing him in double jeopardy, and without the confession, they had no case anyway. Ultimately, he was convicted solely for the attempted rape and assault of Dorcas Callan, drawing a 15-year sentence. Following his conviction, Harvey Carignan traded the shadow of the Alaskan gallows for the grim reality of federal prison. He was initially transferred from the Seward Jail to the penitentiary at McNeil Island, Washington, where he remained for only 4 months. After this short stint, the convict was transferred down the California coast to the infamous federal penitentiary on Alcatraz Island. For Harvey, the Rock was a bleak landscape. Yet, he occasionally considered himself a lucky man simply to be alive. He knew that if his initial murder confession had not been overturned on a legal technicality, he would have been hanged in Alaska in 1950. Inside Alcatraz, he cut an imposing and deeply intimidating figure. Standing a hulking 6'2" and weighing 190 pounds, his face was fixed in a perpetual glowering frown, and he rarely smiled. Known for a volatile temper that made him terrifying when angered, the other inmates quickly learned to give him a wide berth. Consequently, no one bothered him inside the notoriously tough prison. Harvey embraced the isolation, considering the men around him merely acquaintances rather than friends, and remaining emotionally detached from his own family on the outside. Ultimately, his behavior inside the walls earned him enough good time to cut his stay significantly short. After serving just 9 years of his original 15-year sentence, the 32-year-old walked away from Alcatraz as a paroled man on April 2, 1960. Clad in a cheap suit furnished by the government and carrying the new prison nickname, Yankee, he left the West Coast and headed for Duluth, Minnesota, to live near one of his 3 half-brothers. However, his first real taste of freedom since he was an 11-year-old boy, excluding his brief and violent stint in the Army, was remarkably short-lived. After spending barely 4 months and 3 days on the outside, Harvey found himself back in police custody. On August 5, 1960, officers from the Duluth Police Department arrested him, logging 2 stark charges onto his FBI rap sheet: burglary and assault with intent to commit rape. Ultimately, the justice system could not make the sexual assault charge stick, and it was dropped for lack of evidence. Harvey was convicted solely on the burglary charge. Deemed a parole violator, his brief window of freedom slammed shut. He was ordered to serve 2,086 days in the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth, Kansas, and was handed an additional suspended sentence of 2.5 years for the Minnesota State Penitentiary in Stillwater. In 1964, Harvey was granted parole and opted to leave Minnesota behind for a fresh start in the Pacific Northwest. He chose to settle in Seattle, a city he had visited previously during his brief military stint, drawing on the presence of his mother, stepfather, and one of his half-brothers who were already living in the area. On March 2, 1964, Harvey officially registered as a paroled convict in Seattle. However, his attempt at maintaining a lawful life on the outside proved to be remarkably short-lived. He managed to survive on the streets of Seattle for barely 8 months before running afoul of the law once again. On November 22, 1964, King County Sheriff's officers arrested the parolee, levying a charge of second-degree burglary against him. The justice system moved to revoke his brief window of freedom, and on April 20, 1965, Harvey was sentenced to serve a 15-year term in the Washington state penal system. Once again, he traded the outside world for the bleak confinement of a cell, this time shipped off to the state's maximum security prison located in the wheat country of Walla Walla. Locked inside the penitentiary walls, the hulking convict paradoxically transformed himself into a dedicated scholar, eagerly availing himself of the institution's educational programs. He finally obtained his high school diploma before plunging into college-level studies, focusing intensely on sociology and psychology. Demonstrating a superior intelligence that deeply impressed his instructors, Harvey proved to be a voracious reader and a highly adept student. In a chilling display of his calculating intellect, he earned straight A's in his sociology coursework by crafting meticulously researched papers on topics such as the well-adjusted individual, the paranoid personality, and the sexual psychopath. He also dabbled in journalism, though he managed only a C in that particular subject. Yet, beneath this polished academic veneer, the violent predator remained fully intact. Harvey's tenure at Walla Walla was marred by severe disciplinary problems, fueled by his explosive, uncontrollable temper. In one terrifying incident, his rage boiled over into a savage attack on a prison guard. The assault was so vicious that it required 6 guards to finally subdue him, and the infraction landed Harvey in solitary confinement, the whole, for an entire year. Despite this brutal assault and his history of terrifying volatility, the prison system's mechanisms for early release worked to his advantage once again. Harvey managed to accumulate enough good time credits to slash his sentence to a fraction of its original length. After serving just over 4 years of his 15-year sentence, the 41-year-old convict was granted his freedom. On August 12, 1968, Harvey Carignan walked out of Walla Walla, a paroled man, and returned to the streets of Seattle. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. Though he harbored a dark, obsessive fixation on teenage girls as his ultimate sexual choice, the reality of Carignan's middle-aged, hardened appearance made it highly unlikely he could attract a young girl. Adapting to his circumstances, he began courting Sheila Moran, a divorcee with children. In 1969, the couple married, and Harvey moved into her home in Ballard, the Scandinavian district of Seattle. However, the union was doomed from the very beginning. Harvey had expected his new wife to be a soft, sweet maternal figure who would cater to his every need and make him the absolute center of her world. Instead, he found Sheila to be an independent, unyielding adult female, a realization that sparked his deep-seated rage and reminded him of the women who had controlled him in his youth. For her part, Sheila was quickly appalled by the motley crew of ex-convicts who began dropping by her home at all hours of the day and night. She also grew deeply frustrated with Harvey's erratic behavior. He constantly monopolized her car, putting more miles on it in a single year than she had in 5, and she would frequently wake up to find him gone on mysterious all-night drives. The marriage, briefly interrupted by Harvey's return to prison for a parole violation, became increasingly volatile. The tension ultimately culminated in a terrifying episode triggered by a domestic dispute over supper. Enraged that Sheila would not make him a sandwich, Harvey claimed to have heard the voice of God telling him to kill her. He retreated to the basement, found a hammer, and hid behind the furnace all night, waiting to murder his wife. Fortuitously, Sheila and her children had fled the house and did not return that evening. Having witnessed his consuming, blind rage, Sheila realized her life was in imminent danger and sought a divorce. A year later, in early 1972, Alice Johnson, a Seattle woman in her early 30s with long brown hair and a trim figure, had recently gone through a divorce and found her return to single life miserable and lonely. Earning her living by cleaning houses and furniture stores, her social opportunities were virtually non-existent until she began frequenting a small cafe and the adjacent Meet Me There tavern across the street from Seattle's Savmore gas station. It was inside this neighborhood tavern that she met Harvey Carignan. Masterfully masking his hardened, violent past and volatile temper, Harvey unleashed the full force of his charismatic persona, and Alice was entirely taken with him from the very beginning. Desperate for proof that she was still attractive to men, she was easily impressed and believed she had found a hardworking, respectable, middle-aged man, mistakenly assuming he owned the bustling Savmore station that he actually only leased. The courtship was remarkably brief, and the couple was married on April 14, 1972. Following the wedding, Carignan moved into Alice's home, a house she shared with her 11-year-old son, Billy, and 14-year-old daughter, Georgia. The new bride was thoroughly convinced she had found a prize, a smart, industrious man who brought a comforting male presence back into her home. While she was aware that he possessed some sort of criminal record, her gullible nature allowed her to easily swallow his excuses, firmly believing his claims that the police were merely picking on him and using him as a scapegoat. Her family, however, did not share her rose-colored view. Her brother, in particular, looked upon the new groom with deep suspicion. For Alice and her children, the illusion of a perfect marriage would shatter once the honeymoon period ended, revealing Carignan to be a harsh, terrifying disciplinarian to his stepchildren, particularly young Billy, who became the direct target of his new stepfather's explosive rage, suffering several severe beatings. Unwilling to endure the physical abuse any longer, the 11-year-old took decisive action to protect himself. Billy reached out to his biological father, explaining the grim reality of his new home life and pleading to go live with him instead. The desperate phone call worked. Within mere months of his mother's wedding to Carignan, Billy packed his belongings and moved out of the house, successfully escaping his stepfather's brutal grasp. While his older sister, Georgia, also desperately wished to flee the terrifying environment, she ultimately chose to remain in the volatile household because she was deeply worried about leaving their mother alone with such a violent man. The atmosphere inside the North Seattle home quickly deteriorated as Carignan proved to be an erratic, terrifying presence who constantly traveled and collected a small fleet of vehicles. He drove recklessly like a man possessed, accumulating traffic tickets until he lost his driver's license entirely. His explosive rage also turned physical. He brutally belted Alice across the face, on one occasion leaving her with a blackened eye, and on another requiring 5 stitches to close a gash in her lip. Despite the abuse, the gullible Alice rationalized his behavior and vowed simply to try not to anger him. For Georgia, the terror extended beyond witnessing her mother's beatings. Carignan's dark obsession with teenage girls began to manifest inside the home. He constantly stared at his stepdaughter with an intensity that made her feel naked, and he frequently demanded she accompany him on terrifying, high-speed car rides. During one of these inescapable drives, he inappropriately placed his hand on her leg under the guise of fatherly interest, prompting her to beg him to take her home. The breaking point occurred one evening when they were alone in the house. Carignan silently stalked across the room, picked Georgia up, and carried her toward the master bedroom. Only her frantic blows to his shoulders and desperate pleas about her mother's reaction snapped him out of his trance. Shortly thereafter, Georgia fled to California to join her brother and biological father. Blinded by her devotion, Alice felt the household tension ease with her children gone, reasoning that it was best they stay with their father until her marriage was on solid ground. The timing of these domestic shifts coincided with a significant change in Carignan's legal status. On July 28, 1972, his active parole officially ended. He transitioned to inactive parole, a status with virtually no supervision that merely required him to write a letter once a year reporting on his progress. Coincidentally, just one day prior to his parole transition, a sensational crime unfolded in his home state of Minnesota, a crime that would later cast a long, speculative shadow over Carignan. On July 27, 1972, Virginia Piper, the wife of a prominent brokerage firm chairman, was abducted from her affluent Orono home. 2 days and a $1 million ransom later, she was found unharmed but chained to a tree in a Duluth State Park. The location was directly across the street from a farm where Carignan had lived as a boy. Though blindfolded, Piper noted that one of her captors wore rolled-up trousers and prison-issue Red Wing shoes, and she distinctly remembered his conversations about abused children and the Pacific Northwest. Despite circumstantial evidence and media speculation, Carignan consistently denied involvement and was never indicted for the crime before the statute of limitations would expire years later in 1977. In the fall of 1972, the mysterious disappearance of 19-year-old college student Laura Leslie Brock cast a dark shadow over the Pacific Northwest. The young woman had vanished on October 15 while hitchhiking from Western Washington State University in Bellingham to Whidbey Island. The grim conclusion to the search arrived when her nude body, clad only in knee-high stockings, was discovered hidden in a dense fir forest just off an isolated, old logging road on the island. The autopsy revealed a savage attack. She had been brutally bludgeoned, with the entire left side of her head crushed. Evidence at the scene indicated that the teenager had fought her attacker fiercely, as investigators found a few strands of gray-brown hair clutched in her lifeless hand, which crime lab analysts believed came from her killer's chest. As Island County detectives, led by Undersheriff Bob Sharp, canvassed for witnesses, they found a couple who reported seeing a young woman matching Laura's description, hitching a ride on the day she disappeared. The witnesses recalled that she got into a pickup truck driven by a middle-aged white male. They noted distinct details about the vehicle. It had a silver canopy and a peculiar pipe sticking out horizontally near the gas tank. The unsolved murder remained cold until Seattle homicide detectives investigating the later disappearance of Kathy Miller began probing the background of their prime suspect, Harvey Carignan. While checking his driving record, they unearthed a chilling geographic coincidence. On October 15, 1972, the exact day Laura Brock vanished, Carignan had received a traffic ticket in Mount Vernon, Washington, a town located along the direct route to Whidbey Island. The circumstantial evidence linking him to the crime grew even more damning as detectives pieced together Carignan's vehicle history. Investigators learned that Carignan had driven a pickup truck outfitted with a silver canopy and that the vehicle had been specifically modified with a second gas tank featuring a filler pipe that jutted out from its side. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. On May 29th, 1973, the exhaustive search for 15-year-old Kathy Miller led Seattle homicide detectives Dwayne Homan and Billy Bauman to the sprawling, dense wilderness of the Tulalip Indian Reservation, north of Everett. The detectives traveled to the reservation to interview a woman named Kathy Sylvester, a friend whom prime suspect Harvey Carignan was known to visit. While Mrs. Sylvester claimed she had not seen Carignan recently, the visit to her sparsely populated neighborhood chilled the investigators. Looking out over the endless acres of untamed woods, they realized a killer could easily bury a body there and be confident it would never be found. Also, the reservation was located just a short distance from the Everett plywood mill, where Kathy's abandoned schoolbooks had been discovered weeks earlier. Just 5 days later, on Sunday, June 3rd, two 16-year-old boys were riding motorbikes along the reservation's narrow dirt trails when they stopped near Waterworks Road to pick salmon berries. As they pushed their way into the thick brush, they were suddenly hit by the sickly sweet odor of decay. Poking further into the vegetation, they discovered a human form wrapped tightly in a shroud of black plastic sheeting. Snohomish County Sheriff's deputies soon arrived and found the nude, badly decomposed body of a young woman hidden just beyond a fallen log. Recognizing that the victim's height and long blonde hair matched the description of the missing Seattle teenager, local authorities immediately contacted Detectives Homan and Bauman. The following day, pathologist Dr. Emmanuel Bitar confirmed the detectives' worst fears. By comparing the victim's teeth with Kathy Miller's dental records, Dr. Bitar made a positive identification based on a unique silver filling located on the outside surface of her left first permanent molar. The subsequent autopsy and crime scene analysis painted a picture of a brutal, calculated murder. Dr. Bitar determined that Kathy had been struck at least 3 or 4 times on the left side of her head with a heavy blunt instrument, such as a hammer or a 2x4, fracturing her skull and likely causing death within moments. Investigators concluded that the actual murder had taken place elsewhere, after which the killer carefully swaddled the teenager's body in black visqueen plastic to prevent blood from staining his vehicle during transport. Exhaust burns on the grass near the body site indicated that the killer had parked his vehicle with the motor still running, hurriedly dumping his victim in the sylvan bower before fleeing the isolated reservation. When Seattle homicide detectives Duane Homan and Billy Bauman drove to the Pergolus home to deliver the news no parent ever wants to hear, Mary Miller was already waiting for them. Word of the discovery of an unidentified body had somehow leaked to the media, and Mary had already heard the grim reports. She ushered the 2 investigators inside and offered them seats, deliberately refraining from asking why they had come. Deep down, she already knew the tragic truth and realized she could not change it, but she desperately needed a few moments to delay the agonizing confirmation. Breaking the heavy silence, Duane Homan began gently, explaining that her dentist's records had provided a perfect match with the body they had examined north of Everett. "Mary, it was Kathy," he finally told her. Clinging to a fragile shred of hope, Mary asked if they were absolutely certain. When Homan confirmed the tragic news, her eyes brimmed with tears, yet she did not break down and cry. Staring back at the investigators with remarkable calm, she exhibited her characteristic empathy, concerning herself even in her darkest moment with the emotional burden the detectives had to carry. She thanked the men for finding her daughter, admitting that she had been conditioning herself for this exact moment over the past 30 days, though that preparation made the reality no easier to bear. In response to her quiet strength, Billy Bauman offered a solemn vow. He promised the grieving mother that the case was far from finished, pledging that he and his partner would continue working to bring Kathy's killer to justice for as long as it took and for as long as they remained policemen. Despite delivering the tragic confirmation to Mary Miller, Detectives Homan and Bauman were acutely aware that discovering Kathy's body did not immediately give them the legal power to arrest their prime suspect. Hampered by a complete lack of physical evidence, the investigators could not file murder charges and were forced to meticulously retrace the crime's logistics while scrambling to find a definitive link before Harvey Carignan could bolt. They began by driving the route from the Sears store where Kathy had waited to the lonely body site on the Tulalip Reservation. They calculated that the 42-mile journey would have taken 70 to 80 minutes round trip, noting with grim suspicion that the trail where the body was dumped was a mere 1.2 miles from the home of Carignan's acquaintance, Kathy Sylvester. Fearing that Carignan would soon flee the jurisdiction, the detectives dramatically increased the pace of their probe while keeping a close watch on the increasingly erratic suspect. Carignan's employees warned the investigators of his explosive, terrifying temper, noting that he possessed superhuman strength and advising the detectives not to let him get a physical hold on them if an arrest went down. Desperate for a forensic breakthrough, the team focused on the black visqueen plastic shroud found wrapped around Kathy's remains. They located a partial roll of similar plastic in the attic of Carignan's garage, which he had used to cover out-of-service gas pumps at his Savmore station. But crime lab technicians disappointingly concluded it was not from the same lot as the murder shroud. In mid-June, an anonymous informant surrendered the remainder of a roll of visqueen he had previously given to Carignan. But after 4 days of painstakingly trying to match the torn edges in the lab like a jigsaw puzzle, the detectives realized the tear marks did not align. The investigation reached a boiling point when an informant warned Homan and Bauman that Carignan was actively clearing up his affairs to leave town. Utilizing a legal loophole that allowed for the search of a vehicle about to leave a jurisdiction, the detectives finally secured a search warrant from Judge Quigley and moved swiftly to intercept their prime suspect before he could flee the jurisdiction. On the evening of June 19th, the police tact squad staked out the West Seattle home of Harvey Carignan's mother, where the suspect was recently observed loading his belongings in preparation for a trip. Shortly before 7 o'clock, the detectives arrived on the scene with the warrant and a tow truck, which promptly backed up and hooked onto the bumper of Carignan's purple Oldsmobile Toronado. Just as the car was being secured, Carignan pulled up in his pickup truck, bailed out furiously, and marched toward Homan. Knowing the suspect had recently boasted about buying a ball-peen hammer to crush the detectives' heads, Billy Bauman unloosed his service revolver from his holster to protect his partner. However, Carignan brought his hands out empty, and upon being informed of the search warrant, his anger morphed into a sneer. He claimed they could have searched his car any time, but despite his bravado and his casual assertion that he was merely heading to Denver to look for work, beads of sweat poured down his face as he watched the Toronado being towed away. Inside the secure confines of the Seattle police garage, crime lab criminalists John Batista and Don McLaren meticulously photographed, vacuumed, and dusted the seized vehicle for latent prints. The interior was dirty and cluttered with junk, yielding an empty pint of whiskey, plastic baby blocks, hamburger wrappings, an amphetamine pill, and marijuana seeds. To the intense frustration of the investigators, however, there was absolutely no physical evidence linking the car to the missing girl. The sweep turned up no long blonde hairs, no lost buttons, no torn blue and white fabric, and no school books. Yet, the forensic analysis revealed one chilling detail that proved the meticulous killer was not infallible. Batista discovered that the Toronado's windows had been carefully wiped down inside and out, with the exception of the interior surface of the passenger window. From that single overlooked pane of glass, Batista successfully lifted a partial palm print. When compared against the prints of both Harvey and his wife, Alice, there was no match. The print had clearly been left by a smallish female hand. Tragically, this critical piece of evidence could not close the case. Because Kathy Miller's body had lain exposed to the elements for a month, police technicians had only been able to salvage her fingertips for printing, making it impossible to obtain a palm print for comparison. Though investigators firmly believed the print belonged to the doomed teenager, perhaps left as she pressed her hand against the glass in a vain attempt to escape, they would never be able to prove it definitively in a court of law. Still, the smudge on the glass indicated to the detectives that Carignan had been careless, and that it was only a matter of time before he made another mistake. Despite the dramatic seizure of his vehicle, Harvey Carignan remained a legally free man. Because investigators still lacked the definitive physical evidence needed to establish probable cause for the murder of Kathy Miller, they were entirely powerless to prevent their prime suspect from leaving Seattle. While forensic technicians meticulously processed the towed Toronado in the police garage, uncovering a chilling but ultimately inconclusive partial palm print on the interior passenger window, Carignan simply shifted his escape plans to his other vehicle. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. When claiming he was heading to Denver to look for a job and would only be gone for 6 to 8 days, the ex-convict was merely trying to throw the investigators off his trail. Instead of turning his silver-canopied pickup truck east toward Colorado, Carignan drove through the night, heading directly south into California. His characteristic reckless driving ultimately documented his true route. On June 20th, the very day after he fled Seattle, he was cited for speeding in Solano County, California. This traffic ticket temporarily placed him in close geographic proximity to a cluster of unsolved nude murders of young women in the Santa Rosa area, though detectives were never able to definitively link him to those specific California killings. Carignan did not remain on the West Coast for long. He soon drove cross-country, returning to his former home state of Minnesota. Retreating to familiar territory, the fugitive moved into the Minneapolis home of one of his half-brothers. Safe from the intense scrutiny of the Seattle homicide detectives he had grown to despise and fear, Carignan wasted no time in resuming his violent, predatory habits. By June 28, just 9 days after watching his car being towed away in Washington, he was already prowling the streets of Minneapolis. There, a woman named Marlis Townsend was waiting for a bus on a deserted street corner when she became the next target of Harvey Carignan's predatory violence. Standing alone, she suddenly heard the ominous sound of a boot scraping across the sidewalk behind her, accompanied by heavy breathing. Before she even had the chance to turn around and face her attacker, a tremendous blow slammed into the back of her head, immediately knocking her unconscious to the pavement. When Marlis finally came to, she awoke to a terrifying reality. She was trapped inside a moving pickup truck being driven by a huge man. Still foggy and pulsing with pain from the savage blow to her head, she was horrified when the massive driver suddenly grabbed her hand and forcefully attempted to place it on his genitals, angrily barking at her to touch me. Driven by sheer terror and the instinct to survive, Marlis violently pulled away and frantically grabbed for the passenger side door handle. Realizing her desperate intent to escape, the man swore at her and lunged, tightly seizing a fistful of her hair to stop her from tumbling out of the cab. Fortunately for Marlis, her attacker had made a critical miscalculation. She was wearing a wig. As she threw her weight toward the open door, she pulled completely free of his grasp, leaving the hairpiece clenched securely in the startled driver's fist. Marlis hit the pavement hard, but she immediately scrambled to her feet and ran for her life, literally saved by a hair. Looking back, she was able to mentally record the description of her abductor, a man in his late 40s wearing work clothes, and his vehicle, which she noted was a General Motors pickup outfitted with a silver camper. Though battered and terrified, she had successfully thwarted Carignan's attack, fully realizing that she had likely just escaped her own murder. Months later, on September 9th, 13-year-old runaway Jerry Billings was hitchhiking in northeastern Minneapolis, hoping to reach a friend's apartment. At the intersection of Lowry and Central Avenues, a pickup truck equipped with a silver canopy pulled over. The driver, a hulking, balding man in his late 40s, wearing green work clothes and heavy boots, smiled and introduced himself as Paul. Jerry climbed inside and provided a false name, desperate to keep her true identity hidden from her mother and the authorities. As the journey progressed, Jerry realized with mounting alarm that the driver was heading in the wrong direction. taking her away from the city and deep into the isolated countryside. The truck sped far too fast for her to safely jump out, trapping her inside the cab. When she tried to resist his control and squirm away, the massive man grabbed her by the neck with terrifying strength. During the ensuing struggle, he suddenly struck her savagely with a claw hammer. Her vision exploded with flashing lights, and as she began to cry out from the agonizing blow, the man coldly ordered her to shut up. Terrified and whimpering, the teenager crouched against the seat, desperately trying to memorize the truck's interior, specifically noting the two bucket seats separated by a wooden board as they sped past towering rows of corn. Eventually, the man turned the truck into a desolate cornfield, far from the safety of the country road, and ordered her out. When she hesitated, he scooped her up in his arms, carried her deep into the secluded field, and dropped her onto the earth. After subjecting the teenager to further terror by way of violent sexual assault, he yanked her forcefully by the hair. The man surprisingly allowed the battered girl to get dressed and walked her back to the truck. He drove in complete silence until they reached the suburban town of Crystal, northwest of Minneapolis. Abruptly stopping the vehicle, he ordered her out and warned her never to tell anyone what had happened. Jerry sprinted away without looking back, listening to the squeal of tires as her abductor fled the scene. Fearful of being arrested for running away, she hid for 2 days before returning home, initially keeping her horrific ordeal a secret. She was subsequently placed in the Red Wing training school as a habitual runaway, and it wasn't until late October, after mistakenly believing she saw her attacker at a church service, that the traumatized teenager finally reported the abduction to the authorities. In January 1974, while still desperately writing manipulative letters in a vain attempt to win back his estranged wife, Alice, Harvey Carignan crossed paths with 28-year-old Eileen Hunley. The fateful encounter occurred on a cold night when the temperature had plummeted to 24 degrees below zero. Eileen and 2 older women, all Jehovah's Witnesses out doing religious work, found themselves stranded with a broken universal joint. Carignan stopped his truck, played the role of the Good Samaritan, and drove the 3 grateful women to their homes in the suburbs. To the deeply religious and unworldly Eileen, who had recently moved to Minneapolis from Kansas, Carignan seemed like a perfect gentleman and a pious Christian. Captivated by his polite facade, she introduced him to The Way, a fundamentalist church group she belonged to, believing she had found a devout man who was eager to turn his troubled life around. By May 1974, their relationship had blossomed into a close romance, and in June, Carignan even drove Eileen to Gosel, Kansas, to meet her family. Eileen pitied his financial struggles and admired his immaculate, sparsely furnished rented room, completely unaware of his violent criminal record or his status as a prime suspect in a string of brutal murders. However, the illusion of the devout, hard-working suitor shattered in July. Carignan began to exhibit terrifying flashes of temper and a heavy thirst for alcohol, which deeply offended Eileen's religious belief that the body is a temple. When she confronted him about his drinking, his subsequent rage frightened her, prompting Eileen to end the romance and tell him she only wanted to be friends. To Carignan, this was yet another agonizing rejection by a woman. On Saturday, August 10, 1974, Eileen Hunley vanished from her Minneapolis apartment. She left behind all her personal belongings, missing church on Sunday and failing to report to her job at a daycare center on Monday. In a chilling display of callousness, Carignan showed up at the daycare center shortly after her disappearance, claiming Eileen was indisposed and attempting to collect her final paycheck, a request her employers sharply refused. Eileen's fate remained a mystery until September 17th, when a citizen stumbled upon a badly decomposed body in a wooded area in Sherburne County near Zimmerman, Minnesota. Dental records eventually confirmed the victim was Eileen Hunley. The autopsy revealed a horrific end. Her skull had been crushed by hammer blows, and in a final sadistic act of humiliation, her killer had violated the body with a tree branch. By September 1974, Carignan's violence escalated into a frantic, almost daily hurricane of bloodshed. He had traded his pickup for a green 1968 Chevrolet Caprice, which he used to hunt young women across the Minneapolis area. On the afternoon of Sunday, September 8, 1974, 16-year-old Lisa King and her friend June Lynch, who was just one day shy of her 17th birthday, were hitchhiking along Lake Street in Minneapolis. Both teenagers were students at the city's Work Opportunity Center. A green Chevrolet sedan pulled over for them, driven by a large man who appeared to be in his late 40s. Once the girls were inside, the driver offered them an easy opportunity to make $25. He claimed that his son's truck had run out of gas up north in the town of Mora, and he needed someone to drive the stranded vehicle back to Minneapolis while he followed. Intrigued by the offer of cash for a simple driving job, the girls agreed, and the man turned his car north. Before they reached the outskirts of Mora, the driver abruptly pulled off the road into a lonely, densely wooded area. Stepping out of the car, the man revealed his hulking size and reached into the vehicle to retrieve a screwdriver, a 5-gallon gas can, and a hammer. He instructed Lisa to wait in the Chevrolet and told June to come into the woods with him to help get the truck started. June followed the big man into the dense trees, briefly wondering why a truck would be parked so far back in the forest. Suddenly, the man turned toward her, raising his hand with the weapon clutched tightly in his fist. June barely had time to scream before her vision clouded with black smoke and she collapsed to the ground. Waiting in the car, Lisa heard her friend's terrified scream and immediately sprinted into the trees. She found June lying on the earth, bleeding profusely from severe head wounds, while their attacker had completely vanished. Lisa desperately ran to a nearby farmhouse to summon a deputy sheriff, saving her friend's life. June Lynch regained consciousness in the back seat of the speeding patrol car, having no memory of the actual blows or why the stranger had attacked her without provocation. At the emergency room, physicians determined she had been struck in the head at least 7 times with the hammer, suffering a severe concussion. Though she would be plagued by pounding headaches and dizzy spells for weeks, she miraculously survived the brutal ambush. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. On the morning of September 14, 1974, 19-year-old student nurse Gwen Burton encountered a middle-aged man in green work clothes who offered to help start her stalled blue Ford in a Minneapolis Sears parking lot. Claiming he needed to retrieve his tools from his home, the man grabbed Burton by the elbow and pushed the hesitant teenager into his green Chevrolet Caprice, rapidly speeding away toward rural Carver County. Once isolated on a gravel road, the terrifying ordeal escalated into brutal physical violence and graphic, humiliating sexual assault. The massive man choked Burton repeatedly until she blacked out. Reveling in his victim's helplessness, he told her, "I like to see you suffer," and punched her violently in the stomach, knocking the breath out of her. When Burton hopelessly asked if he was going to kill her, he sinisterly replied, "You shouldn't say things like that. You'll give me ideas." Stepping behind the car, he returned gripping a claw hammer. "Now I am going to kill you, you whore," he announced before bringing the heavy tool crashing down onto her skull, leaving her crumpled and bleeding. Burton later regained consciousness at the bottom of a 6-foot-deep gully, lying in a pooling circle of her own blood. Exhausted and bleeding from a severe head wound, she considered simply lying back down to die, but the memory that her sister was expecting a baby fueled a desperate will to survive. In a harrowing display of endurance, Burton dragged herself out of the steep ditch and spent hours crawling on her stomach across a vast, harvested alfalfa field, tearing her skin as she pulled her battered body over a barbed wire fence. As dusk approached, she finally reached the roadside, where her frantic cries for help alerted a passing farm boy on a tractor. Rushed to Abbott Hospital in critical condition, surgeons operated for hours to elevate a depressed skull fracture and pick bone fragments out of her left brain tissue. Though she miraculously survived the brutal ambush, The lingering injuries forced Burton to abandon her nursing studies and left her to battle partial paralysis, unstable balance, and aphasia. On an early Wednesday, September 18, 1974, 18-year-old Sally Versois was hitchhiking to her classes at the Work Opportunity Center in Minneapolis when a man driving a light green 1971 Chevrolet Caprice pulled over. The driver, a large, balding man who appeared to be around 50 years old and dressed in green work pants, offered her an easy way to earn $25. He asked her to travel with him into the country north of the city to drive a stranded vehicle back. Intrigued by the cash offer, Sally agreed, but explained that she first needed to stop at the school to meet her 17-year-old friend, Diane Flynn. The driver obliged, returning shortly after 9 o'clock to pick up both teenagers before heading north. During the journey, the man spun a strange tale about having been robbed and beaten on the head with a hammer, a story that vaguely reminded Sally of a recent brutal attack on a fellow student that had left the girl hospitalized. Despite their growing unease over his strange demeanor, the girls assumed they would be safe because there were two of them. However, the situation turned terrifying when the driver pulled the Caprice into a deserted area, stopped the vehicle, and asked them a chilling question. If you had a choice, would you rather be raped or killed? When both girls immediately replied that they would rather be killed, the massive man merely grunted and resumed driving. As Diane, who was sitting in the middle of the front seat, began to complain suspiciously about how far they were traveling, the man suddenly snapped his right hand off the steering wheel and viciously backhanded her in the face. The brutal blow left Diane with a bleeding lip and two chipped teeth. Desperate to engineer an escape, Sally quickly intervened and suggested she and Diane trade places so that the injured teenager could sit near the passenger door. The driver stopped to let them shift seats, but he hovered deliberately outside the car, successfully preventing them from making a run for it. Fortunately for the teenagers, the man's dark intentions were thwarted by his own oversight. Glancing at his dashboard, he cursed as he realized his gas gauge was registering on empty. Forced to pull into a service station in the town of St. Francis to refuel, the man inadvertently gave the girls the opening they so desperately needed. The moment the car stopped, Sally and Diane bolted from the vehicle and sprinted into the safety of the station, successfully escaping their abductor. On a Friday, September 20th, 1974, 18-year-old Kathy Schultz left her South Minneapolis home to run an errand at the Work Opportunity School. The teenager, known for her long blonde hair and the bright red bandana she habitually wore around her neck, was hitchhiking near the intersection of 54th or 56th and Lyndale, just 3 blocks from her house, when Harvey Carignan pulled over to pick her up. Rather than taking her to her destination, Carignan abducted the young woman, driving her 40 miles north of the city to a desolate cornfield in Izani County near the small town of Dalbo. In that isolated field, Carignan subjected Kathy to a savage attack that occurred during the commission or attempted commission of rape or sodomy. He brutally murdered the teenager by raining crushing blows down upon her head. When Kathy failed to return home by dusk, her frantic family checked her room and discovered a chillingly prophetic essay she had just written that began with the words, "If I should die." The tragic conclusion to the search arrived the next day, September 21st, when 2 pheasant hunters, walking through the tall grass and corn shocks of Azanti County, stumbled upon her crumpled, lifeless body. Her face was completely destroyed and her hair was matted with blood, but her distinctive red bandana was still tied around her neck. In the fall of 1974, as the wave of brutal assaults and murders swept across several Minnesota jurisdictions, law enforcement officials realized they were tracking a single, highly dangerous predator. Recognizing the escalating violence and striking similarities between cases, Hennepin County Sheriff's Detective Archie Sonnenstall convened a joint task force meeting on Monday, September 23rd at the Hennepin County Courthouse. The gathering brought together investigators from Hennepin, Carver, Sherburne, Kennebec, and Isanti counties, alongside the Minneapolis Police Department, the Minnesota State Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, and the Medical Examiner's Office. As the detectives exchanged details of their respective open cases, a chillingly consistent modus operandi emerged, leaving no doubt that they were hunting the same man. The surviving victims' descriptions of their attacker varied only slightly, painting a uniform portrait of a massive, balding man in his late 40s or early 50s, characterized by a distinctively dome-shaped forehead, deep facial furrows, a dimpled chin, and scruffy sideburns. The suspect invariably wore green work clothes with his pants tucked into heavy lace-up boots, chain-smoked Camel cigarettes, used violently obscene language, and possessed terrifying physical strength. Beyond his physical appearance, the attacker left a sadistic signature that inextricably linked the crimes together. The task force noted that he routinely threatened and bludgeoned the young women with a claw hammer, and in a horrific deviation from typical sexual assault, frequently used the wooden handle of the hammer to violate them. The crucial link that bound the wide geographic spread of the crimes together was the suspect's vehicle. While he had previously driven a blue or pale-colored pickup truck outfitted with a silver camper, the victims of the most recent attacks consistently described being abducted in a four-door, pale green Chevrolet Caprice featuring a black interior. Adding a vital piece of physical evidence to the behavioral and vehicular profile, Isanti County Deputy Sheriff Edgar Olson presented a plaster cast of a tire tread recovered from the dirt near where murder victim Kathy Schultz had been dumped. Local wholesalers had identified the tread as belonging to an Atlas brand belted tire, giving investigators a specific brand to match to the Caprice. Armed with this cohesive profile, Sonnenstahl drafted a confidential memorandum detailing the suspect's description and the green Chevrolet Caprice, dispatching the bulletin to every police patrol within a 100-mile radius of Minneapolis with an urgent request to locate the deadly vehicle and its driver. On Tuesday, September 24, 1974, the balance of the investigation finally shifted when two Minneapolis police patrolmen working the city's south sector noticed a towering, bald man dressed in green work clothes and heavy boots walking across a parking lot. The officers watched closely as the man climbed into a pale green Chevrolet Caprice, a vehicle that perfectly matched the urgent bulletin circulated by the Joint Law Enforcement Task Force. As the Caprice exited the lot, the patrolman pulled in behind it, prompting the driver to accelerate and attempt evasive maneuvers, darting recklessly through traffic and making abrupt turns down side streets to lose his tail. Stymied by the pursuit, the driver was forced to pull over when the officers activated their flashing blue lights. Approaching the vehicle, the patrolman confirmed the car featured the suspect black interior and asked the driver for identification. The man identified himself as Harvey Carignan, visibly betraying his panic as sweat poured down his face and a nervous tic violently seized his right eye and forehead. When an officer informed Carignan that he was under arrest for murder and began to recite his Miranda rights, the hulking suspect dismissively waved his hand and sneered, "I know all that shit." Following the arrest, investigators meticulously traced Carignan's vehicular history, discovering that he had purchased the Caprice in January 1974 after trading in a 1968 Chevrolet pickup truck, the same truck with a silver camper that earlier victims had described. Minnesota detectives quickly tracked down the pickup's new owner in North Minneapolis, learning that the man had driven the vehicle a mere 130 miles before stripping its paint and storing it securely inside a shed. With the new owner's consent, Hennepin County Detective Archie Sonnenstahl conducted a search of the truck's cab. Reaching beneath the front seat, Sonnenstahl made an unsettling discovery. Hidden away were a quantity of long human hairs and a collection of folded road maps covering Washington, Oregon, Idaho, California, Montana, Wisconsin, and Kansas. As the detective unfolded the documents, he observed a disturbing detail that would deeply unnerve the investigators. Meticulously drawn across the various states were 181 red circles, explicitly marking seemingly isolated and desolate areas that detectives immediately feared were coded geographic locations of undiscovered graves. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. In the second week of February 1975, Harvey Carignan went on trial for the attempted murder and aggravated sodomy of student nurse Gwen Burton in District Judge Arlo Herring's Carver County courtroom in Chaska, Minnesota. Facing prosecutor William Glazer, defense attorneys Douglas Thompson and Joseph Friedberg mounted a shocking and risky defense, not guilty by reason of insanity. In his opening statement, Thompson warned the jury they were about to hear a harrowing story, freely admitting that Carignan's acts were even more sordid than the prosecution alleged. The defense claimed Carignan was a severe paranoid schizophrenic who had been sexually traumatized since infancy, causing him to hate women and believe he was on a divine mission from God to kill harlots and whores. The prosecution laid out the stark horror of Carignan's crimes, highlighted by the incredibly brave testimony of Gwen Burton herself, who took the stand on February 24th. Speaking softly, the tiny, dark-haired woman gave an agonizing 2-hour account of her ordeal, testifying that Carignan forced her to perform oral sodomy, violated her with a hammer handle, choked her repeatedly until she passed out, and finally bludgeoned her skull with a claw hammer. She then described her desperate, hours-long crawl across miles of fields to survive. In a bizarre strategic move, the defense called another of Carignan's victims, June Lynch, to the witness stand, hoping her brutal account of being struck 7 times in the head with a hammer would help prove Carignan's total madness. Meanwhile, Seattle homicide detective Duane Homan, the investigator Carignan hated and feared most from his time in Washington, sat in the front row of the courtroom, hoping his presence would silently unnerve the defendant. The trial's climax arrived when Harvey Carignan took the witness stand to tell his own story, casually dressed in an open-necked sports shirt over a t-shirt. Maintaining a pious, humble facade, he calmly confessed to the brutal attacks, testifying that God's voice, speaking from up in the air, had explicitly ordered him to humiliate and kill Gwen Burton because she was a whore. However, his insanity defense began to crumble under prosecutor Glazer's sharp cross-examination. Glazer revealed that while imprisoned at Walla Walla years earlier, Carignan had taken college-level sociology courses and received an A on papers detailing the symptoms of the sexual psychopath and paranoid, strongly suggesting he had simply studied the pathology and was faking his mental illness. Furthermore, Carignan admitted he had dragged Burton's body into a ditch to hide her because he knew the act was illegal, showing a clear understanding of right and wrong despite his religious claims. The trial quickly became a battle of psychiatrists. Defense expert Dr. Hector Zeller argued Carignan suffered from a defect of reason and psychotic delusions, while prosecution expert Dr. Dennis Philander countered that the killer's calculated concealment of the crime proved he fully appreciated the wrongfulness of his behavior. On March 3, 1975, the jury rejected the insanity plea and found Carignan guilty of attempted murder and aggravated sodomy. Following this conviction, Carignan immediately faced a second trial in the first week of April 1975 in Hennepin County, presided over by Judge Crane Winton. This time, he was charged with 4 counts of sodomy and indecent liberties for his September 1973 attack on 13-year-old Jerry Billings. Because the traumatized teenager struggled to recall the exact dates of her abduction, Assistant County Attorney John Brink bolstered the case by bringing in all 6 surviving victims, including Burton, Lynch, Sally Versoa, Diane Flynn, and Marlis Townsend, to testify, establishing a horrifying, undeniable pattern of predatory action. Taking the stand once again, Carignan dropped the Religious Insanity Act entirely, rationally denying he had ever seen Billings or owned the silver-canopied truck she described. The jury was completely unconvinced, finding him guilty on all counts on April 18th. On May 5, 1975, Harvey Carignan's judicial reckoning culminated when Judge Herring sentenced him to 30 years in prison for the Burton case, after which he was immediately driven to Minneapolis, where Judge Winton handed down a second 30-year sentence for the brutal attack on Jerry Billings. Following his consecutive 30-year sentences handed down on May 5, 1975, for the brutal sodomy and attempted murder cases of Gwen Burton and Jerry Billings, Harvey Carignan's judicial reckoning was far from over. On June 19, 1975, an Isanti County grand jury indicted the massive, balding predator on first-degree murder charges for the brutal slaying of 18-year-old Catherine J. Schultz. Isanti County Attorney John Dablow explained that the indictment met both sections of the state's first-degree murder statute, alleging the bludgeoning was premeditated and had occurred during the commission or attempted commission of rape or sodomy. The legal net tightened further on September 4, 1975, when Carignan was arraigned on a second set of first-degree murder charges by a Sherburne County grand jury, this time for the brutal death of his former girlfriend, Eileen Hunley. Appearing before Judge Robert Baca, Carignan initially entered no plea, and his defense attorneys successfully secured a change of venue to Anoka County, arguing that widespread pretrial publicity had prejudiced the case. As the Schultz trial loomed, many expected a drawn-out courtroom battle, but Carignan surprised observers by accepting a plea bargain. On February 9, 1976, he waived his constitutional rights and pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of second-degree murder for Kathy Schultz. The prosecutor had agreed to the lesser charge to spare the surviving victims the grim burden of testifying again, and because Carignan already faced a practical maximum sentence under Minnesota law. Taking the witness stand, Carignan coldly confessed that he had picked up the hitchhiking teenager in South Minneapolis on September 20, 1974, driven her to a desolate cornfield near Cambridge, and killed her. When Judge Baca asked if the blunt instrument used was a hammer, Carignan calmly corrected him, stating it was a tool similar to a mountain climbing tool or a trenching tool. Disgusted by the testimony, Judge Baca told the defendant his crimes were so gross that there is no point in commenting on them, to which the enraged killer snapped, "Don't comment on them then." Carignan was promptly sentenced to an additional 40 years. With the Schultz case closed, legal observers widely assumed Carignan would also plead guilty to the murder of Eileen Hunley to avoid a life sentence, especially since the prosecution was poised to paint him as a heartless monster who murdered the devout young woman who had only tried to lead him into a religious life. Inexplicably, Carignan chose to take his chances before a jury. During the ensuing trial, prosecutors highlighted the chilling fact that shortly after Eileen vanished in August 1974, Carignan had shown up at the daycare center where she worked to casually collect her final paycheck, showing absolutely no concern for the woman whose skull he had shattered and whose body he had violated with a tree branch. The jury remained completely unconvinced by Carignan's defense. On June 24, 1976, Harvey Carignan was convicted of first-degree murder for the bludgeoning death of Eileen Hunley and was sentenced to life in prison, bringing his horrific spree to a definitive judicial end. In 1978, Harvey Carignan made his final judicial bid for freedom when the Minnesota Supreme Court heard his appeal. The case raised significant legal questions about the insanity defense, particularly regarding whether juries should be informed of the actual consequences and commitment procedures involved when acquitting a defendant due to mental illness. Although two justices argued that juries should be given accurate information to prevent them from speculating that a dangerous defendant might go free, the court majority ruled against such disclosures and unanimously upheld Carignan's convictions on August 11, 1978. 5 years later, on February 16, 1983, Carignan was among the very first group of proven violent offenders transferred to Oak Park Heights, a newly constructed, highly sophisticated maximum security prison in the Minnesota correctional system. That same year, his notoriety attracted the attention of the media, and he granted a videotaped interview to CNN's Larry Wood for a documentary on American serial killers. Wearing a cream-colored cowboy shirt and leaning back in his chair, the towering inmate mused that he would have been a hell of a person if he had not gotten into trouble, blaming his violent history on hallucinations and a childhood imaginary friend named Paul. However, when Wood asked him directly about Kathy Miller, Carignan flew into a rage, glared at the cameras, and flatly declared, "There is no Kathy Miller." It was also in early 1983 that the tragic, frustrating case of Kathy Miller reached a quiet administrative resolution in Washington state. Seattle Police Detective Duane Homan, who had spent years hunting Carignan, retrieved the dusty accordion files of the Miller investigation from the department vault. Thwarted by the lack of physical evidence that had prevented detectives from ever trying Carignan for the teenager's death, Homan turned to the final page of the file and firmly wrote a concluding entry dated January 31, 1983. He noted that the case was closed, exceptional, and explicitly recorded that Catherine Sue Miller's killer was currently incarcerated in the Minnesota State Prison. While this brief notation changed nothing in a court of law, it permanently sealed the Seattle Police Department's official recognition that Harvey Carignan was the man who murdered Kathy Miller. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. For the remainder of his life, Carignan was kept behind bars, never securing release despite becoming eligible for his first parole hearing in May 1993. Within the prison walls, he was admired by some convicts for his intellect, having previously served as the editor of the Stillwater prison newspaper, though he was chillingly referred to in whispers as Harv the Hammer. He maintained a strict calisthenics routine that preserved his intimidating physical strength well into his later years, even after he developed prostate cancer in 1997. Ultimately, Carignan died of natural causes at the age of 95 on March 6, 2023, while still incarcerated at Oak Park Heights. His death effectively closed the door on any potential future prosecutions for the numerous unsolved murders believed to be linked to the 181 red circles found scrawled on his personal maps. Back in Seattle, Mary Miller channeled the agonizing loss of her daughter into a lifelong, nationwide crusade for victims' rights. She continued living in the same home she had shared with her children and parents, and while maintaining her job at a bank, she devoted her free time to the organization she helped establish, Families and Friends of Missing Persons and Violent Crime Victims. Over the ensuing decades, Mary traveled to over a dozen states to advise new chapters and brought her impassioned advocacy to Washington, D.C., where she testified as an expert before the United States Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Victims' Rights. In May 2007, at the age of 72, her relentless dedication was recognized when she received a humanitarian award from the Snohomish County chapter of the American Red Cross. Famed true crime author Ann Rule, who nominated her for the honor, praised Mary for surviving unbelievable hardship and choosing to spend her life comforting other traumatized survivors rather than surrendering to grief. Even in her 70s, Mary continued taking the bus 3 days a week from the University District to Everett to answer phones and offer solace to newly grieving families. Kathy's younger brother, Kenny, also found his own path toward healing as he grew into a tall, handsome man. Born with developmental disabilities, Kenny had initially struggled to grasp his sister's death, telling his friends that she had simply married and moved to California. By his late 20s, however, he had come to understand the tragic reality of her murder and stopped inventing fictional stories. Finding steady employment in a sheltered workshop, Kenny coped with the emptiness of his family's home by frequently bringing back strays, both animals and homeless individuals who were down on their luck and needed a warm meal or a place to sleep. Today, Kathy Sue Miller's memory survives largely through her mother's monumental advocacy work, which paved the way for improved counseling services, crime victim funding, and systemic changes to parole board evaluations. Though Carignan was never formally convicted in a Washington courtroom for Kathy's death, the case is functionally cleared and remains a resolved cornerstone in the region's cold case history. In a strange modern footnote, the name Kathy S. Miller briefly resurfaced in April 2026 in an entirely unrelated Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals decision regarding Social Security disability benefits, an odd coincidence that occasionally causes archival confusion in digital legal databases. Nevertheless, the true legacy of the Miller family remains their unwavering resilience and their enduring fight to ensure that the victims of violent crimes are never ignored by the justice system.